Girl, don't you know you're so beautiful? I wanna give all my love to you, girl.
It's just worldview warfare. In the previous episode, we continued our deep dive into revolutionary worldview warfare by discussing technique. In this episode, we are going to focus on the rhetorical aspect of technique, propaganda. Propaganda, the most infamous component of revolutionary worldview warfare. Throughout world history, propaganda theorists have debated propaganda's power. For some, propaganda is weak in comparison to physical warfare. You know, the fists, projectiles, poisons, missiles. For others, propaganda is impossible to avoid and its influence is impossible to escape. The vast majority of propaganda theories fall into one of those two extremes. Now recall that I mentioned Jacques Ellul in previous videos. I like Ellul's propaganda theory because it balances both of those extremes in an interesting way. On one hand, he admits that propaganda cannot create something out of nothing. It must tap into something that is already within the target audience. On the other hand, Ellul notes that resisting strong propaganda requires an uncommon psychological education or an uncommon spiritual force. Ellul draws an analogy between propaganda and the sea. The countless waves on the sea's surface symbolize what Ellul refers to as active propaganda. The sea as a whole symbolizes what Ellul refers to as sub-propaganda. So what is sub-propaganda? Sub-propaganda exploits the conditioned reflexes and expresses the myths previously established over time through technique. Myths are powerful images of how reality could or should be. The most powerful images tap into individuals' emotionality as well as their sense of the sacred. Conditioned reflexes are expedient reactions to myths. The most expedient reactions tap into the impulsivity of groups. An example is mob mentality. Together, conditioned reflexes and myths serve to subconsciously prepare target audiences for action when the opportunity arises. The action which sub-propaganda prepares target audiences for is defined by the active propaganda. Active propaganda comes in many forms, but all basically boil down to either integration or agitation. Agitation propaganda cultivates and/or reinforces mass strife. Agitative messaging is often simplistic, provocative, and direct. Integration propaganda cultivates and/or reinforces mass solidarity that is in the propagandist's favor. Integrative messaging is often indirect, evocative, and subtle. Together, integration and agitation propaganda harness the mysterious power that language has to both reflect and shape our awareness of as well as our interpretation of reality. Think about how much our deeds are affected by what other people say to us, and even what we say to ourselves. The words we speak, as well as our actions, are communicative. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned how propaganda is the rhetorical aspect of technique. This is because propaganda is a specialized, we can say weaponized form of deliberative rhetoric. Deliberative rhetoric basically refers to communication intended to persuade a target audience that doing or thinking something now will either benefit or hurt them in the future. Propaganda is more than simply deliberative rhetoric because propaganda's venom is wicked deception. I will go into more detail on wicked deception in the next video. Now I'm going to bring together all of the points I've discussed so far by analyzing a real-life case. We will analyze the evolution of some propaganda designed to persuade target audiences that participating in the great work now will benefit all mankind in the future. Recall what the great work is. Basically, the great work symbolizes humankind's attempt to attain godhood and to create utopia. When I say creating utopia, I am referring to the notion of creating collective peace and prosperity within the dystopia of the world system. In other words, the notion that humankind can establish order out of chaos. When I say attaining godhood, I'm referring to the notion of attaining unity of the self and the divine in essence. In other words, the notion that an individual can somehow unlock some innate quality of divine personhood. This is also referred to as awakening the divine within. Let's start with the sub-propaganda. Throughout this analysis, you will see the myth of techno-scientific progress. This myth is very powerful when it taps into the emotionality of prejudice and pride, as well as the sacredness of peace and security. Also throughout this analysis, you will see a conditioned reflex being evoked, that of the group survival response. This conditioned reflex is very expedient when it taps into the impulse to group up based on abstract, manipulable identifiers. Secondarily, you will see the evocation of another conditioned reflex, that of applying science to areas outside of scientific purview. This conditioned reflex is very expedient when it taps into the impulse to abuse science for socio-political purposes. Remember that sub-propaganda exploits the conditioned reflexes and expresses the myths previously established over time through technique. Technique is the manifestation of humankind's reliance upon culture and technology to manage the insecurities inherent to life in the world system. On the cultural side of this analysis, we have the following. For religion, mystery religion and Christianized animism. For science, empiricism and biological pseudoscience. For art, statues and paintings. For politics, law and economics, imperialism and prostitution. For philosophy, Neoplatonism, scientism, and romanticism. On the technological side of this analysis, we have the magnetic compass and rose. Both of those greatly advance the seafaring, facilitating deeper transcontinental interaction. The arrangement and trajectory of technique is informed by the zeitgeist. And the zeitgeist refers to the natural and supranatural inspirations shaping and reflecting the hearts and minds of the masses in a given space and time. The zeitgeist can be measured by analyzing the spread and impact of ideological terms. This analysis will highlight some of the neo-Hellenistic inspirations at work in 18th century Western Europe. The ideological term for this analysis is Caucasian. So what we have here is the basis for a call to action, which would evolve into something like this.
Our scientific priesthood has proven that the Caucasian race is blessed with physical and moral beauty.
Thus ours is the ancient and noble task of perfecting, through creative destruction, all the races.
Let's unpack the evolution of this active propaganda messaging.
In the late 18th century, Jan Friedrich Blumenbach, an 18th century German scholar, assigned the name to people living in Western Europe, to the River Ob in Russia, to Northern Africa, and to India. Call them Caucasian. It's a large group of people. Blumenbach enjoyed a scholarly reputation that gave his designation enormous heft, and it got picked up very quickly. Although the term Caucasian now has many synonyms, including white, it retains a certain currency by dint of repetition. Jan Friedrich Blumenbach, the father of physical anthropology, the father of scientific anthropology, call the people in Europe, over to India, well into Russia and North Africa, Caucasians, because they were the most beautiful in the world. And here you have Blumenbach and the skull that inspired the designation. And Blumenbach says, also for the determination of the really most beautiful form of skull, which in my beautiful typical head of a young Georgian female, always of itself attracts every eye, however little observant. Blumenbach had 82 skulls, and this made him an expert in human taxonomy. He made a five-fold designation, a taxonomy of human types. He called them varieties. He arranged the skulls according to difference. So at the two ends were the Mongolian and the African, and he thought of them as the extremes. In the middle is the beautiful one. It's the gorgeous median, and that's the Caucasian. And then the ones beside the Caucasian are the American and the Malay, because he thought those were the intermediate races.
Blumenbach's highly influential race theory put various tenets of ancient Greco-Roman mystery religion into modern Christian Neoplatonic terms. We get a glimpse of this in Blumenbach's motivation to choose the Georgian woman's skull in the first place. He felt that the skull's form corresponded perfectly to that of one of his friend's Greco-Roman statues of a nymph. In Greco-Roman mystery religion, nymphs were minor nature goddesses intimately associated with a major nature goddess, also known as the goddess of beauty. Keep that association in mind for later. Also, the goddess of beauty comprised the ancient Greeks' first life-size representation of a naked female. In keeping with empiricism, Blumenbach rooted his scientific claim on new measurement methods at his disposal, as well as his collection of more skulls from more nations than any of his academic competitors. It is interesting to note that many of Blumenbach's skulls are still stored at the Georg August University of Göttingen, Germany, where he was a faculty member. Other faculty at the time included Adam Weishaupt, founder of the now infamous scientific priesthood known as the Bavarian Order of the Illuminati. Anyway, Blumenbach's disciples evolved his race theory and successfully positioned aspects of it into European and especially British imperial practice. One of his most influential disciples, the Briton Samuel Taylor Coleridge, was a founder of Romanticism. Coleridge studied at Göttingen and introduced superiority into Blumenbach's race theory. Other race theories existed at the time, such as that of Göttingen faculty and Illuminati member Christoph Meiners. Meiners' writings would later be revered by the Nazis. Anyway, for Coleridge, Caucasians are superior because the Caucasians alone have a vision of racial perfection through creative destruction. This vision was defined as moral beauty. Because of their moral beauty, Caucasians had the responsibility of civilizing the other races and thereby making the vision a reality.
So, in short, Blumenbach's most beautiful skull, the one in the middle, gave this large group of people, which we can call white people, but it includes many others, the name Caucasian. Now, a fuller answer. We need to look at Russian imperialism and English imperialism, scholarly networks, and slavery. Slavery, which gave rise to the figure of the odalisque, that is the beautiful white slave girl, as a figure of quintessential beauty. So this is about beauty not only of skulls, but also of slave girls.
Those last two images are of well-known pieces of European art of the odalisque. We see that the odalisque was depicted along the spectrum of Caucasian diversity. Remember I mentioned the goddess of beauty? The Greco-Roman goddess of beauty is intimately associated with the creative destruction that takes place in these three contexts of deep desire. The body, especially sexual love arising out of prostitution. The state, especially the political harmony arising out of war. The sea, especially the economic prosperity arising out of treacherous international navigation. Notice that Blumenbach's definition of the Caucasian race, people groups having European, North African, West Asian, or South Asian ancestry, essentially defines a corporate military coalition of Hellenized, i.e. westernized nations. That is why imperialism was mentioned in the video clip. Then we have the prostitution issue. In ancient times, prostitution associated with state temples was big business. Sex trafficking is still lucrative and operates largely in the domain of organized crime, which has long colluded with governments worldwide. The predatory yet lucrative nature of prostitution and the divisive yet unifying nature of race theory both reflect the vengeful yet seductive nature of their patron deity, the goddess of beauty. You will see that propagandists throughout world history to today draw from ancient spirituality to craft agitative and integrative messages for their target audiences. In conclusion, there are 4 key takeaway points from this episode. Number 1, propaganda is a weaponized form of deliberative rhetoric that consists of sub-propaganda and active propaganda. Number 2, sub-propaganda exploits the conditioned reflexes and expresses the myths previously established over time through technique. Number 3, active propaganda is either agitative or integrative in character. Number 4, propaganda works to attract and eventually submerge the target audience in an artificial reality that the target audience itself helps to maintain. These discussions are a companion to my book entitled Revolution: An Introduction to the Art and Science of Worldview Warfare. It cites hundreds of scientific articles and elite books on propaganda. Thanks for your time. Stay tuned. Next, we will explore wicked deception in greater detail.